Oops, I wasn't even talking. Okay, now I'm recording. Hello, is this thing on? Okay, phew, here goes nothing. So I got 99 over here. Today we're gonna read Being and Nothingness again. This is like the start of the book. And also, you wanna see what I ate? Here. Could almost have a snack review. Unless this would dox me, but like whatever. Here, look at this. Look at this. Organic soft-baked mini cookies, red velvet, nut and gluten-free, and they're naturally flavored. Um, if I were to do a food review, they almost tasted good. They like came pretty close, but like they didn't taste that good. But like if it was like from a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being yeah, I would eat this, and the 1 being yeah, I wouldn't eat this. Well, okay, at that point, I guess it would be a 10 because I ate it. So I guess like from good to bad, it's probably like a 6. That's it. That's all I had. Okay, ready to start reading. Okay. Introduction. In search of being. Number 1. The idea of the phenomenon. Now, and before we get started, I guess I would recommend reading the past 2 parts, like to get context for some translations and whatever if you want to read those, and also because I also need views really badly. I guess not that bad, it's just because I'm a low attention whore. But anyway, in search of being, and then I'm gonna read the footnote here. Translator's note, Sartre's introduction is entitled A la recherche de lettres. I've been guided in my translation by the thought that Sartre probably intended to echo Proust's A la recherche du temps perdu. Note that Proust is used as an example within Being and Nothingness's opening pages. Okay, let's get to the... Now we can get to the first part. The idea of the phenomenon. By reducing the existent to the series of appearances that manifest it, modern thought has made considerable progress. The aim was to eliminate a number of troublesome dualisms from philosophy and to replace them with the monism of the phenomenon. Has it succeeded? And also, I guess I probably gotta look some of these words up. Hold on. Well, I guess I might as well look up dualism. Dualism is a family of views, a fundamental division into 2 separate principles. Yeah, I probably could have told you that. And monism, it probably has something to do with 1. The philosophical view that reality is one thing. I think from what I'm looking here, it's like duality is like there's a part of matter and there's a part of mind. And for monism, there's only one part that's like matter is more important or mind is more important. But anyway, now we can go. Sorry. Well, I'm not sorry. In the first place, we have certainly got rid of the dualism that opposes an existence inside to its outside. The existent no longer has an outside, if by that we mean some skin at its surface that conceals the object's true nature from view. And if this true nature is, in turn, to be the thing's secret reality, something we can do, something that we can anticipate or assume, but that we can never reach, because it is inside the object in question. That does not exist either. The appearances that manifest the existent are neither internal nor external. They are all of equal worth, Each of them refers to other appearances, and none of them has priority. Force, for example, is not a metaphysical conatus of some unknown. I'll look up that word too. Conatus. On the first page, it's a conatus Spinoza. Effort or endeavor, an innate inclination of things to continue and exist and enhance itself. From Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. The conatus of some unknown kind. Man. Concealed behind its effects, accelerations, deviations, etc. It is the sum of these effects. Similarly, an electric current has no secret other side. It is nothing but the collection of physiochemical actions, electrolytic processes, the incandescence of a carbon filament, the movement of the galvanometer's needle, etc., that manifest it. None of these actions is sufficient to reveal it, but it does not point to anything behind it. Each action points to itself and to the total series. From this, it obviously follows that the dualism of being and appearing no longer has a legitimate place in philosophy. An appearance refers to the total series of appearances. I think they mean like it's the showmanship kind of appearance, like how you appear at a birthday party. That's what they were like talking about before. Not to some hidden reality that siphons off the existence being for itself. And the appearance, for its part, is not an unstable manifestation of that being. For as long as we were still able to believe in nominal realities, the appearance was presented as purely negative, as that which is not being. Yeah, I'm already lost. It has no being other than that of illusion and error. But the thing was itself borrowed, it was itself a sham, and the biggest problem facing us was how to maintain the appearance with enough cohesion and existence to stop it from being reabsorbed into non-phenomenal being. But once we have freed ourselves from what Nietzsche called the illusion of backworlds, and there's a little translator note, so let's go down there. Sartre is loosely quoting a French translation of Nietzsche's "Thus Spake Zarathustra." The French arrêté mons is used to translate Nietzsche's German neologism Hinterwelten, which is often translated into English as backworld. The idea is that of a world beyond or behind the world we experience. Man, I might have to read this again. I think what he's trying to say is like, when he was talking about the carbon filament and the galvanometer, it's like that happens because of physics and because like, I guess there's not really too much to like explain. Well, there is a lot in the idea of physics, but it's like it just happens like because. But the reality is I actually don't know anything. I think I forgot to, I should mention this at the start. I'm not a philosopher. I have no degree. I'm not particularly intelligent. Like, I'm basically a fucking idiot, but garbage sometimes has to crawl its way out of the gutter and try to at least imitate a human. At least that's what I believe. So like when I try to tell you things I think about, like, don't believe anything I say or take it with a grain of salt or whatever. And if we no longer believe in any being behind appearance, the appearance becomes, on the contrary, full positivity. Its essence is an appearing that is no longer opposed to being, but which is, on the contrary, its measure. For the being of an existent is precisely the way it appears. Thus we are led to the phenomenon as we encounter it. For example, in Husserl's or Heidegger's phenomenology, the phenomenon or the absolute relative. The phenomenon remains relative because its appearing necessarily implies someone to whom it appears, but it does not have the twofold reality of Kant's Erscheinung. And here's translate note number 3. Kant's term Erscheinung is normally translated into English as appearance. Okay, back to the sentence. It does not indicate behind its shoulder some true being, a being that it itself the absolute, a being that is itself the absolute. It is what it is absolutely, because it is disclosed as it is. The phenomenon can be studied and described as such because it is absolutely indicative of itself. Yeah, I'm already getting yawny and wiping my nose. And I have to wipe my nose now. And I'm using a pair of scissors as a bookmark. At the same time, the duality of potentiality and actuality will collapse. Okay, now let's go translator note 4. Sartre is referring to the distinction between energeia and dunamis in Aristotle's metaphysics. Both terms are variously translated in different English translations. I use actuality and potentiality for Sartre's acte and puissance. Everything. Okay, and now back to the part. Everything is in actuality. Behind the act, there's neither potentiality nor hexis nor virtue. So now let's go translator note 5 and 6. Number 5. The ancient Greek term hexis is important in Aristotle's philosophy, although it is agreed to be difficult to translate Aristotle's exact meaning. Habit and disposition are both commonly used. Translator note 6. Sartre uses the French word vertu here in its older sense to mean a power or active principle, as it is used in English philosophy in the well-known example of normative virtue. Oh yeah, of course, everybody knows that. Like, now I gotta go look it up. Normative virtue. A translation of Latin. A type of tautology. Ugh. The classic fallacy of defining an effect as its own cause. Explanations along these lines answer questions truthfully but vacuously. They state there exists something, so I don't know. It's like LARPing. LARP, LARP, LARP. It's like if somebody said, why is the sky blue? Oh, the sky is blue because, there must be something explaining why the sky is blue. Maybe, maybe not though. Probably not. Okay, back to the book. We were like right here. Actually, I'm looking not gonna point out. You should use this purely as an audiobook. I'm just showing. I don't even know why I'm showing the book, to be honest. I'm probably gonna get it taken down. It's okay. It's okay. It doesn't fucking matter. The term genius, for example, as it is used when we say Proust had great genius or he was a genius, should not be taken to mean a distinctive power to produce various writings, a power that is not exhausted in producing those writings. Proust's genius is neither his work considered in isolation, nor the subjective power to produce it. It is his work, seen as the set of manifestations of his person. That is why we can, in the end, also reject the dualism of appearance and essence. Appearance does not hide essence, but reveals it. So I guess he's talking about like the duality, right? Of appearance and essence is like you can appear to be intelligent or you can have the essence of intelligence. Oh, yeah, I have no idea. Like, bro is not onto anything. It's like looking like you're smart. It is the essence, he says. So, like, did he say appearance is basically the essence? The essence of an existent is no longer a power embedded deep inside it. It is the manifest law governing the succession of its appearances, the principle of the series. Duhem was right to oppose Poincaré's nominalism, which defined a physical reality, for example, an electric power. Yeah, we're going back to the galvanometer thing, as the sum of its various manifestations. With his own theory, according to which a concept is the synthetic unity of those manifestations. Man, this was putting me asleep. Okay, and now translator note 7. Translator note Pierre Duhem, 1861 to 1916, was a French physicist and philosopher of science. Henri Poincaré, 1854 to 1912, was a French mathematician, physicist, and philosopher of science. Okay, back to the book. Of course, nothing could be farther from nominalism than phenomenology, but ultimately, in essence, understood as the principle of a series is no more than the connection between the appearances, which means it is itself an appearance. This explains how an intuition of essences, Husserl's Wesensschau, for example, is possible. Or Wesensschau. Yeah. So like get into like some Inception type stuff. But like, yeah, I have no idea what's going on. Translator note 8. Husserl's English translators usually render Wesensschau as intuition of essences. So Husserl's intuition of essences, for example, is possible. Thus, phenomenal being manifests itself. It manifests its essence just as much as its existence, and is nothing but the interconnected series of these manifestations. Does that mean we have succeeded in eliminating all dualisms by reducing the existent to its manifestations? It seems rather that we have. seems rather that we have converted them into one new dualism, the finite and the infinite. For the existent cannot be reduced to a finite series of manifestations, as each of these is a relationship to a constantly changing subject, while an object may only be given through a single Abschaktung. Probably means abstraction, right? Well, the translator note will tell me. The mere fact of being a subject implies the possibility of multiplying the points of view onto that Abschaktung. Translator note 9. The term Abschaktung, maybe I should zoom in a little more. Oh, yeah. I don't know, that kind of makes it harder to see, to be honest. I mean, it makes it easier to see, but it's already too difficult to see, so whatever. The term Abschaktung refers in Husserl's phenomenology to the incomplete aspect of an object given in perception of it. For example, to the one side of a six-sided die that we may be able to see, Kirsten translates it as adumbration, Husserl 1983. It is sometimes translated as profile. Okay, and this amounts to multiplying the Abschaktung in question to infinity. Furthermore, if the series of appearances was finite, it would follow absurdly that the ones appearing first could not reappear, or even more absurdly, that they could all be given at the same time. So it's like you can't see every single side of a six-sided die at the same time, right? You can only see like a few sides at once, maybe. We need to be quite clear on our theory of the phenomenon that has replaced the thing's reality with the phenomenon's objectivity, and that it founds this latter by appealing to the infinite. The reality of this cup is that it is there, and that it is not me. Yeah, I think we can agree with that. The cup is there, and the cup is not me. We can express this by saying that the series of its appearances is connected by a principle that does not depend on my whim, but an appearance considered just as it is, without reference to the series to which it belongs, can only be an intuitive and subjective plenitude. The way in which the subject is affected, if a phenomenon is to show itself as transcendent, the subject himself must transcend the appearance toward the total series of which it is a member. He must grasp redness, example, the principle of the series, through his impression of red, the electric current throughout the electrolysis, etc. But if the object's transcendence is grounded to the necessity that any appearance can be transcended, it follows axiomatically that the series of appearances for any object is posited as infinite. Thus, a finite appearance indicates itself in its finitude, but at the same time, in order to be grasped as an appearance of that which appears, it demands to be surpassed towards the infinite. The new opposition, the finite and the infinite, or better still, the infinite within the finite, replaces the dualism of being and appearing. What appears is in effect only an aspect of the object, and the object is entirely within this aspect and entirely outside it. Entirely inside insofar as it manifests itself in this aspect. It is indicated as the structure of the appearance, which is at the same time the principle of the series, entirely outside, because the series itself never appears and cannot appear. Thus, once again, the outside is opposed to the inside, and the being that does not appear is opposed to its absence. Similarly, a certain power returns to the phenomenon, inhabiting it and endowing it with its very transcendence. The power to be developed through a series of real or possible appearances. Even if we reduce Proust's genius to the works he produced, it is still equivalent to the infinity of possible points of view that we can take up on Proust's work. Its so-called inexhaustibility. But this isn't inexhaustibility, which implies a transcendence and an appeal to the infinite, a hexis, even at the very moment in which we apprehend it in the object. In the end, the essence is radically cut off from any individual appearance that manifests it, because it must be possible, as a matter of principle, for it to be manifested by a series of individual manifestations. By replacing it in this way, a variety of oppositions with a single dualism that founds them all, have we gained or lost? Soon we shall see. For now, the primary consequence of the theory of the phenomenon is that the appearance does not refer to being in the way which the phenomenon in Kantian philosophy refers to the noumenon. Because there is nothing behind the appearance, and it indicates nothing more. There is nothing behind the appearance, and it indicates nothing more than itself, and the total series of appearances. It cannot be supported by any beings other than its own. It cannot, therefore, be the thin skin of nothingness, separating subject being from absolute being. In the essence of appearances is an appearing that is no longer opposed to any being. There is genuine problem of the being of this appearing. This is the problem with which we are concerned here, and it will be the positive departure for our investigations into being and nothingness. Okay, yeah, that was a lot. Yeah, okay, look some stuff up. Infinity and the finite. Sattva. Now, of course, I'm just gonna go on Reddit and like look shit up. Or should I just like, read the whole fucking book and then start wondering? Like, I feel like I should like start looking stuff up at the beginning before I like get too confused, because like it does not seem like this is, obviously this is a very beginner unfriendly book. It's a fucking evil ass book, but whatever. To the phenomenon of being and the being of the phenomenon. And they did say there are gonna be like a ton of run-on sentences and like grammatically incorrect and like, shitty stuff like that. An appearance is not supported by some other, different existent. It has its own being. The first being that we encounter in our ontological investigation is therefore the being of appearance. Is that being itself an appearance? So it seems, at first sight. A phenomenon is something that manifests itself, and being manifests itself in some way to all of us, since we can talk about it and have some understanding of it. Thus there must be a phenomenon of being, an appearing of being, and can be described as such. Being will be disclosed to us through through some immediate means of access, boredom, nausea, etc. An ontology will be the description of the phenomenon of being as it manifests itself, i.e., without intermediary. However, for any ontology, we need to ask a preliminary question. Is the phenomenon of being that we reach by these means identical to the being of the phenomena, or is the being that is disclosed to me, that appears to me, the same in nature as the being of the existence that appears to me? Here, there seems to be no problem. Husserl showed us how an eidetic reduction is always possible. Yeah, can I look that word up? Eidetic reduction. It's a core method in Husserl phenomenology. Identify the basic components of phenomena. A mental object. Hold on, can I drink some water? Okay, for example, Descartes' piece of wax. A piece of wax is opaque, flat, hard, and extends to a certain dimension. It has a certain smell, feel, or taste. Most of these qualities can be negated as necessary as the piece of wax continuing to be a piece of wax. If you melt a piece of wax, and if you melt it until it evaporates, well, no. The only things that remain its extension into space, chemical makeup, and mass are the things that required for the existence of that piece of wax. Oh man. The basic step of an eidetic reduction are threefold. Choose some specific examples and then verify the example imaginatively. The third step figures out that which cannot be eliminated while the example remains itself. For example, a triangle is a triangle if one of its sides is extended but a fourth side is added. If a fourth side is added, it's not a triangle. So this shows that having three sides is essential to being a triangle, while having a specific side length isn't. So as you guys want to do some thinking together. That's like the whole point of that's the whole point of me reading this book. So it's like, let's say we have like an apple, and it's like, oh, it's a pretty yummy apple. Like, what if I took like a bite out of it, or I took two bites out of it, or I ate it to its core? Would it still be an apple? Yeah, it would still be an apple. What if the apple is green instead of red? That's still an apple, right? What if the apple didn't have any colors? It would still be an apple, right? So what defines the apple? A shape? No, there's square apples, right? There's square apples. I think you can have like yellow apples. What if I ate the apple and like I digested it in my stomach? Would it still be an apple? What if the apple like didn't have any seeds? Would it still be an apple? Or like, if it was a crab apple, does that still apple? It has apple in its name, but isn't it like a berry or something? I fucking hate crab apples. When I was in school, there used to be this path where I walked like I would have to keep walking. At one time, I slipped on the ice, and there's a crabapple tree, and like I fucking hit my head really hard, and all the disgusting like mushed up crab apples were like beneath me. Oh my god! And there was another side that didn't have any crab apples, but when we went home, I always was forced to walk on that side because I was too young to choose my own path. Oh, sorry, crab apple rant. It's like my eighth time doing a crab apple rant. But like if I digested my tummy, like it's not an apple anymore, right? Or like to what extent does it not become an apple? Like how dissolved does it have to be before the apple is not an apple? And then like when I shit it out, like is it still an apple? No, it's just shit. Okay, anyway, maybe I'm tweaking out. Maybe that's like not even what they were talking about. Ontology, however, for ontology, we need to ask a preliminary question. Is that the being that appears to me in the same nature as the being of the existent appears to me? Here, there seems to be no problem. Husserl shows us how an eidetic reduction is always possible. In other words, we can always surpass a concrete phenomenon towards its essence, and for Heidegger, human reality is ontico-ontological. Which means it can always surpass the phenomenon towards its being. Okay, and then translator note number 10. Sartre probably has being and time in mind in here. Heidegger, 1980. But to move from a particular object to its essence is to move between two homogeneous items. And homogeneous means like well mixed, right? Can the same thing be said of the movement from an existent to the phenomenon of being? In surpassing an existence toward the phenomenon of being, are we really surpassing it towards its being as we might surpass a particular red towards its essence? Let us take a closer look. In a particular object, we may always distinguish qualities such as color, smell, etc. And on the basis of these, we can always establish the essence they imply, just as a sign implies its meaning. The object-essence pair is organized whole. The essence is not inside the object. It is in the object's meaning, the principle of the series of appearances which disclose it. But the object's being is neither one of its qualities, capable of being grasped among others, nor is it a meaning of that object. The object does not refer to being as it might refer to a meaning. It is not possible, for example, to define being as a presence, since absence also discloses being, since not being there is still a way of being. So like even if the apple was digested, it would still be there, would it? Just in a different form. Maybe, I don't know. The object does not possess being, and its existence is not a participation in being or any kind of relation. The only way to define its way of being is to say that it is. For the object does not conceal being, but neither does it disclose it. For the object does not conceal being, but okay, I'm in a word loop. But neither does it disclose it. It does not conceal it. It would be futile to set aside some of an existence qualities to try to find its being behind them. Its being belongs to all of them equally. It does not disclose it. It would be futile to appeal to the object in order to apprehend its being. The existence is phenomenal. In other words, it designates itself as a phenomenon, no, as an organized set of qualities. Itself and not its being. Being is merely the conditioned form of its disclosure. It is being in order to disclose, not being disclosed. What then does Heidegger mean when he speaks of a surpassing toward the ontological? Of course, I can surpass this table or this chair towards its being, and I can pose the question of the table being or chair being, but in the moment I look away from the table phenomenon in order to fasten on the being phenomenon, which is no longer the condition of all disclosure, but which is itself something disclosed, an appearance which as such needs in its turn some being on whose foundation it can be disclosed. If the being of phenomena cannot be resolved into a phenomenon of being, and if, however, we can only say anything about being like how many words times is it gonna say that? But obviously that's like the whole point of this book. By consulting this phenomenon of being, we must establish first and foremost the exact nature of the relationship that joins the phenomenon of being to the being of the phenomenon. The being. This will be easier if we note that all our observations so far were directly inspired by the revealing intuition of the phenomena of being. By considering being not as the condition of disclosure, but rather as an appearance that can be fixed in concepts, we have understood in the first place that knowledge alone cannot account for being. Example, that the being in the phenomenon cannot be reduced to its phenomenon of being. In brief, the phenomenon of being is ontological in the sense in which Saint Anselm's and Descartes' proof is called ontological. It is a call for being. It requires, insofar as it is a phenomenon, a trans-phenomenal foundation. The phenomenon of being requires the trans-phenomenality of being. That does not mean that being is hidden behind the phenomena. We saw that the phenomenon cannot mask being, nor that the phenomenon is an appearance that refers to a being distinct from it. The phenomenon has a qua appearance. Example, it indicates itself on the foundation. Actually, I means that is. It indicates itself on the foundation of being. The preceding considerations imply that, although the being of the phenomenon is coextensive with the phenomenon, it must escape the phenomenal conditions in which existence is possible. In which existence, the preceding considerations imply that although the being of the phenomenon is coextensive with the phenomenon, it must escape the phenomenal condition in which existence is possible only to the extent that it is revealed, and consequently that it overflows and founds any knowledge that we can have of it. Okay. Yeah, let me look up like phenomenon of being versus being a phenomenon. I'm only getting like shitty. I'm basically only getting Reddit threads. Okay, like now I gotta do like a bunch of stupid research. Empirical intuition, primordial way. No wonder nobody likes philosophy, bro. And of course, I gotta create an account to read the whole story. Fuck you. Like everything is fucking paywalled now. And you know, there's probably a way to get past it. Consciousness or the often hidden reality. You know what? Just click on Reddit instead of reading the fucking AI overview. Yeah, maybe I should just re-get all my philosophy from Reddit, bro. Like, fuck this. Okay, back to reading. Like, I just used to look this shit up and there's like nothing. That's not true. There have been like entire fucking studies done on this stuff, so like, how could I not find anything? But it probably means I have to go look, like, I have to go look in like university fucking pages. The pre Okay, number three, the pre-reflexive cogito and the being of the percipere. One might be tempted to reply that all of the difficulties mentioned so far stem from a particular conception of being, a kind of ontological realism that is wholly incompatible with the very idea of appearance. Indeed, the being of an appearance is proportionate to its appearing. And since we have limited reality to this phenomenal, we can say of the phenomenon that it is as it appears. And they keep like italicizing appears because it's a different kind of appears, probably. Why not pursue this idea right to its limit and say that the being of an appearance is its appearance, is its appearing? That is simply a way of clothing Berkeley's venerable phrase esse es precipi in new words. And effectively, that is just what Husserl does when, having carried out the phenomenological reduction 11, he treats the noma as irreal and declares its esse to be a percipi 11 and 12. So let's read footnote 11 and 12. Translator notes, see my notes on the phenomenological reduction in the section on Husserl vocabulary in the notes of the translation, and go see my video, my past video. Yeah, we're all begging each other to watch our videos. Translator notes, Husserl says this on page 98 of Ideas, Husserl 1983. Berkeley's formula esse es percipi means to be is to be perceived. Percipere is the section in the section's title is the infinitive form of to perceive in Latin. For the terms noema, noesis, and irreal, see the section on Husserl vocabulary and notes on the translation. Yeah, okay. Berkeley's famous formula seems unlikely to satisfy us, and especially this for two reasons. First, hey, aren't you not allowed to use and to start a sentence? And also my fingernails are getting really long. I should probably cut them. But anyway. And essentially this is for two reasons. Or is that a fucking comma? And I messed it up. I'm lost now. No, it's a period. First, because of the nature of the percipi, and second, because of the nature of the percipere. The nature of the percipere, if any metaphysics, presupposes a theory of knowledge. It is equally true that any theory of knowledge presupposes a metaphysics. That means, among other things, that an idealism aiming to reduce being to our knowledge of it must first account in some way for the being of knowledge. If, on the contrary, you begin by positing the latter as a given without any concern to found its being, and you go on to claim that esse es percipi, which is to be perceived, the perception perceived totality, deprived of any solid being to support it, will collapse into nothingness. Thus, the being of knowledge cannot be measured by knowledge, it escapes the percepi. Thus, the foundation being of the percipere and the percepi must itself escape the percepi. It must be trans-phenomenal. And then let's go look at footnote 13. Sutra's note. It goes without saying that any attempt to replace the percipere by some other attitude of human reality will be equally fruitless. If you allow that being is revealed to man in his doings, you still need to establish the being of the doing apart from the action. Okay. Thus the foundation being of the percipi and the percipi must itself escape the percipi. Must be transphenomenal. We are back where we begin. Okay. However, one might allow that the percipi refers to a being that escapes the laws of appearance while still maintaining this transphenomenal being that is the subject's being. The percipient would therefore direct us towards the percipience, the known towards the knowledge, and this latter to the knowing being insofar as he is, and not insofar as he is known, i.e., to consciousness. Husserl understood this, for in his view, the noema is a real correlative of the noesis, whose ontological law is the percepi. He regards the noesis as the contrary as reality, whose chief characteristics is to offer itself up to the reflection that knows it as having been there first. For the law of being that governs the knowing subject as being conscious, consciousness is not a special kind of knowledge called inner sense or self-knowledge. It is the subject's dimension of trans-phenomenal being. Let us try to improve our understanding of this dimension of being. We said that consciousness is the knowing being insofar as he is, and not insofar as he is known. In consequence, we ought to abandon the primacy of knowledge if we want to found that knowledge itself. And without doubt, consciousness can know and it can know itself, but it is in itself something other than knowledge turned back on itself. This guy's just chatting, bro. As Husserl showed, all consciousness is consciousness of something. 14. Let's look at footnote 14. Translator note, Husserl makes this point in many of his writings. See, for my example, Husserl 1960-72. In other words, there is no act of consciousness that does not posit a transcendent object, or, if you prefer, consciousness has no content. We need to give up these neutral givens that can constitute themselves according to the chosen system of reference into the world or the psyche. A table is not in consciousness, not even as a representation. A table is in space, beside the window, etc. Indeed, the table's existence is a center of opacity for consciousness. An infinite process would be required to make an inventory of the total content of a thing. To introduce this opacity within consciousness would be to refer to infinity any inventory that consciousness might make of itself, to turn consciousness into a thing and to reject the cogito. Which is, I think it means think in Latin, cogito ergo sum. I think something. Think therefore I am. Philosophy's first course of action, therefore, should be to expel things from consciousness and to restore the true relationship between this latter and the world. Namely, that consciousness is a positional consciousness of the world. All consciousness is positional in that it translates itself to reach an object, and it is exhausted by this act of positing. All that is intentional in my consciousness is directed outside, toward the table. All my judicative or practical activities and the affectivity of the moment transcend themselves. They aim at the table, and they are absorbed within it. Not every act of consciousness is a form of knowledge. For example, there are affective modes of consciousness, but every knowing consciousness can only be knowledgeable of its object. Nonetheless, the necessary and sufficient conditions for a knowing consciousness to be knowledgeable of its object is that it should be conscious of itself as being this knowledge. It is a necessary condition. If my consciousness were not conscious of being conscious of a table, it would thereby be conscious of the table without being conscious that it was so, or alternatively, it would be a consciousness that did not know itself, an unconscious consciousness, which is absurd. Okay, like consciousness. I think it's like, if you can't like imagine the table, is it like there? Or like, the table that I'm you reading this book on. Like, what if I didn't know it was there? And like I walked around it and I never like touched it, but I would bump into it by accident, right? So even if I knew it wasn't there, like my senses would eventually tell me. Like if I was blind and I walked into a room, I wouldn't know if the table was there. But like when I bump into it, then I know it's there. But like it's not like you can like walk through a table and like never find it out or like phase through a table, right? So it has to be there. Maybe, maybe. It is of course sufficient for me to enable me to claim that the table exists in itself, but rather that it exists for me. What is this consciousness of consciousness? We are in the grip of the illusion of the primacy of knowledge to such an extent that we are willing to turn our consciousness of conscious immediately into an idea idea, as Spinoza does. In other words, to turn it into a knowledge of knowledge. Okay, and 15, Spinoza. What does Spinoza say? Translator note: Spinoza advances this view of self-consciousness in part 2 of his Ethics, Spinoza 1985. Okay. When Elaine came to express the evident fact that to know is to be conscious of knowing, he translates it into these terms. To know is to know that one knows. Those who know, those who know, those who know. And then funk music starts playing. Which is hereby defined. What is hereby defined is reflection, or the positional consciousness of consciousness, or better still, knowledge of consciousness. This is to be understood as an act of consciousness that is complete in itself and directed towards something that it is not. In other words, towards the reflective consciousness. It thus transcends itself and, like our positional consciousness of the world, it's aiming at its object. It's aiming at its object exhausts it. Only in this case, its object is itself an active consciousness. The interpretation of the consciousness of consciousness does not seem acceptable. The reduction of consciousness to knowledge effectively imports the subject-order duality, which is typical of knowledge within consciousness. But if we accept the law of the knowing-known dyad, a third term will become necessary for the knowing in its turn to become known, and we are placed in a dilemma. Either we stop at some term within the series, the known, the knowing that is known, the knowing of the knowing that is known, etc. So like a series of endless paradoxical knowing that you know. Like you know that you know that you know. Like I know the table exists. I know that I know the table exists. I know that I know that I know the table exists. And so on and so forth. I.e., we come up against a reflection that is not conscious of itself, and that is the final term. Like, I'm not conscious of myself knowing that the table exists. I just unconsciously know it, but by thinking about it, then I consciously know that unconsciously I know it, and so on and so forth. Or we declare an infinite regress, idea, etc., to be necessary, which is absurd. In this way, the necessity of ontologically founding knowledge is duplicated by a new necessity, that of founding it epistemologically. Surely we know not to introduce the law of the dyad into consciousness. Consciousness of self is not a dyad. If we want to avoid an infinite regress, it must be immediate. It must be an immediate and non-cognitive relationship of self to self. Moreover, reflexive consciousness posits the reflected consciousness as its object in the act of reflection. I bring judgments to bear on my reflected consciousness. I am ashamed of it. I am proud of it. I want it. I reject it, etc. The immediate consciousness that I have of perceiving does not allow me to judge or to want or to be ashamed. It does not know my perception or posit it. All that is intentional within my current act of consciousness is directed outward toward the world. On the other hand, this spontaneous consciousness that I have of my perception is constitutive of my perceptual consciousness. In other words, any positional consciousness of an object is at the same time a non-positional consciousness of itself. If I count the cigarettes that are, in this case, my impression is that of disclosing an objective property of this group of cigarettes. They are 12. This property appears to my consciousness as a property existing in the world. I may well have no positional consciousness at all of counting them. I do not know myself as counting. Proof of this can be seen in the fact that children who are capable of spontaneous addition are unable to explain afterwards how they did it. The test by Piaget, do you guys know the Piaget test? It's like when the baby like crawls on the cliff, like on the glass, the baby like thinks that it's gonna fall off. Or like when they ask like what's, like they give you like a really thin glass and a thick glass and they pour the same water in, they ask you which one has more water. And the kid will say the taller one, the skinny one has more water because it's more full. Anyway, the tests by Piaget, which demonstrate this, constitute an excellent refutation of Elaine's formula. To know is to know that one knows. And yet, at the moment, when these cigarette sticks disclose themselves to me as 12, I'm non-thetically conscious of my adding activity. 16. Une conscience non-thetique. See more on these on the subject of Husserl's vocabulary. In notes on the translation, also watch my video part -1. Okay. Indeed, if I'm questioned, if somebody asks me, what are you doing? I will... Oh, I almost ripped the page. I'll reply immediately, I'm counting. And my reply does not only aim at the instantaneous act of consciousness that I can reach through reflection, but also as those acts of consciousness that have passed by without being reflected on, which will forever remain unreflected in my immediate past. Thus, reflections lack any kind of primacy in relation to reflected consciousness. It is not by means of the former that the latter is revealed to itself. On the contrary, non-reflexive consciousness is what makes reflection possible. There is a pre-reflective cogito, which is the conditions of the Cartesian cogito. At the same time, my non-thetic consciousness of counting is actually the condition of my activity of addition. How, if it were otherwise, could addition be the unifying theme of my acts of consciousness? In order for that theme to preside over the whole series of syntheses, of unifications, and of recognitions, it must be present to itself. Not in the manner of a thing, but as an operative intention that can exist. Only, to use an expression of Heidegger, as a revealing revealed. Footnote 17, let's go. Comme revelant révélé. I have not been able to find this exact phrase in Heidegger. Sartre probably took it from Corbin's preface to his translation. Here, Corbin says the mode of being in human reality is the être relevant et en même temps reality révélée, using these phrases to translate Heidegger's Urschelstand and Urschlosenheit. Okay. Thus, in order to count, it is necessary to be conscious of counting. Of course, it might be said, but that is circular, Because isn't it necessary for me to be able to be conscious of counting, in fact, that I am counting? That I, in fact, am counting. That is true. However, that does not lead to a circle, or alternatively, it is the very nature of consciousness to exist in a circle. We express this in these terms. Any conscious existence such as the consciousness of existing. We can understand now why the most basic consciousness of consciousness is not positional, because it and the consciousness of which it is conscious are one and the same. In a single moment, consciousness determines itself as consciousness of perception, and as perception, the requirements of syntax here have obliged us until now to talk of non-positional consciousness of self, but we cannot go on using this expression, in which the phrase of a self still evokes the idea of knowledge. From now, we will put the of between brackets to indicate that it answers only to a grammatical constraint. 18. See my notes on conscience to SWA on notes on the translation. Okay. We're still on the introduction. This is like, when am I gonna get to the next chapter? Hold on, did I miss it? Yeah, I did. We should not regard this consciousness of self as a new act of consciousness, but as the only possible mode of existence for any consciousness of something. So it's like, if you're conscious of knowing stuff, that's like the only thing you can be. You can't be like you can't be like not conscious. Or you actually can, but you have to like if something doesn't reach your mind, does it exist? I guess is what you're saying, is what they're saying. Like, actually, I have thought this for a while. It's like, like when you watch TikTok and it's like you see like a funny meme and then you tell your friend about it, but they've never seen the meme before. Like when you tell them about it, it's the only time when they become conscious of it. And like you show them and it's like, oh, like I didn't know that. Right? So it's like sometimes there's like stuff that's right on the outside of your consciousness that you're not able to grab without help, I guess. It's like when you find like a new niche song or like a niche TikToker or a fucking niche thing, since everyone wants to be niche now, it's like you gain that kind of consciousness. Anyway. Just as an extended object is constrained to exist in 3 dimensions, so an intention, a pleasure, and a pain can exist only as immediately conscious of themselves. The being of an intention can only be consciousness. Otherwise, the intention would be a thing inside consciousness. We must therefore not take this to mean that some external cause, an organic disturbance, an unconscious drive, another Erlebnis, 19, footnote 19. The term Erlebnis came from Husserl, who uses it to mean experience in a broad sense. In deference to this broad sense, Kirsten translates it as mental process. Husserl, 1983. French translations picking up the sense of leben, to live, sometimes render it as le vecu, or vecu. That probably doesn't sound right. Erlebnis can determine the production of a psychological event, a pleasure, for example, and that the event whose material structure is hereby determined will in addition be compelled to produce itself as conscious of self. That would make non-thetic consciousness into a quality of positional consciousness in the sense in which perception as a positional consciousness of the table might have the additional quality of consciousness of self, and would thereby lead us back to the illusion of the theoretical primacy of knowledge. In addition, it would turn the psychological event into a thing and qualify it as conscious. as I may qualify, for example, this blotting paper as pink. Pleasure cannot be distinguished, even logically, from the consciousness of a pleasure. The consciousness of pleasure, consciousness of knowing that you're feeling pleasure, is constitutive of pleasure, as its very mode of existence, as the matter of which it is made, and not as a form that is subsequently imposed on some hedonic matter. Pleasure cannot exist before any consciousness of pleasure, not even in virtual form, whereas potentiality, like the potential to feel good, I don't know, can it? It's like, you know, it's like sex is the potential to feel good. No, sorry, I use like the most nasty one. Like eating a yummy food is like you can like wait, you can like want the pleasure, but the idea of the pleasure and the actual pleasure are not the same existence. Maybe. Yeah. There, he's saying it right now. A potential pleasure can exist only as a consciousness of its potentiality. There are no virtualities in consciousness that are not conscious of being virtual. Conversely, as I showed earlier, we must avoid defining pleasure in terms of my consciousness of it. That would push us into an idealist view of consciousness that would lead us back in a roundabout way to the primacy of knowledge. We must not let pleasure disappear behind the consciousness of itself. It is not a representation, but a concrete, full, and absolute event. Pleasure is no more a quality of consciousness of self than consciousness of self is a quality of pleasure. It is no more true that there is first a consciousness which afterwards becomes affected by pleasure, like water being dyed. That there is a first pleasure, unconsciousness or psychological, which afterwards receives the quality of being conscious, like a beam of light. There is one indivisible and insoluble being, not a substance that supports its qualities as lesser beings, but a being that is existence through and through. The pleasure is the being of the consciousness of self, and consciousness of self is the pleasure's law of being. Heidegger formulates this well when he writes about Dasein, to be exact, rather than consciousness, that the how essentia of this being must, if it is possible to speak at all, be conceived in terms of its being, Extentia 20. Sartre is quoting from Being in Time, page 9. This means that consciousness is not produced as a particular exemplar of an abstract possibility, but that, in arising in the heart of being, it creates and maintains its essence. That is, the synthetic arrangement of its possibilities. This also means that the being of consciousness is opposite in type to the being revealed to us by the ontological proof, as consciousness is not possible before being, but instead comprises in its being the source and condition of all possibility. Its existence implies its essence. This is felicitously expressed by Husserl as its factual necessity. 21. See my note on Husserl factual necessity. For there to be an essence of pleasure, there must first be the fact of some consciousness of this pleasure. And any attempt to invoke the alleged laws of consciousness, whose articulated sum would be to constitute its essence, will be futile. A law is a transcendent object of consciousness. It is possible to have consciousness of a law, but not a law of consciousness. For the same reasons, it is impossible to assign to consciousness any motivation other than itself. Otherwise, we would need to conceive of consciousness to the extent to which it is an effect, as not being conscious of itself. In some respect, consciousness would need to be without being conscious of being. We would succumb to that all too common illusion that makes consciousness into something half unconscious or passivity. But consciousness is consciousness through and through. It cannot therefore be limited to anything than itself. We must not conceive of this determination of consciousness by itself as a genesis or a becoming, because that would require us to support that consciousness is prior to its own existence. Nor must we conceive of this self-creation as an act. In this case, consciousness would be consciousness of itself as an act, which it isn't. Okay, I'm getting kind of lost. Consciousness is a plenum of existence, and this determining of itself is an essential characteristic. We must be careful not to misuse the expression cause of itself, which can lead one to suppose a progression, a relationship between a self-cause and a self-effect. It would be more accurate to say quite simply that consciousness exists through itself. And this, we do not mean that it is drawn out of nothingness. 22. There could not be any nothingness before consciousness, nothingness of consciousness before consciousness. 23. So let's look at 22 and 23. Translators note, Quel se tier du niant. This phrase is often used in French to refer to the act of creation, as in God's creation of this world out of nothing, for example. 23. Niet de conscience. I'm not sure why Sartre puts this phrase within quotation marks, although it is attempting to translate it as the non-being of consciousness, because that sounds better in English. I'd stick to nothingness for consistency. Before consciousness, we can conceive only a plenum of being, no element of which could refer to an absent consciousness. For there to be nothingness of consciousness, we would need a consciousness that has existed and is no longer, and a witness consciousness positing the nothingness of the first consciousness. In the service of synthesis from recognitions, consciousness is prior to nothingness and derives from being. 24. Sartre's note. This does not at all imply that consciousness is the foundation of its being. On the contrary, and we will see later, the being of consciousness is fully contingent. We wish to point out merely that 1. Nothing is the cause of consciousness, and 2. Consciousness is the cause of its own way of being. Perhaps these conditions are difficult to accept, but examined more carefully, they seem perfectly clear. The paradox is not that some existences exist through themselves, but that there are any that do not. What is genuinely unthinkable is passive existence. In other words, an existence that can perpetuate itself without having enough power either to produce or to conserve itself. From this point of view, nothing could be more unintelligible than the principle of inertia. For if consciousness was indeed able to come from something else, where would it come from? Out of the limbo of the unconscious or the physiological? But if we ask, in turn, how such a limbo can exist and how it derives its existence, we find ourselves led back to the concept of passive existence. In other words, we are absolutely unable to understand how these givens, which are not conscious and do not derive their existence from themselves, might nonetheless perpetuate this existence and even find the power to produce a consciousness. We see a clear symptom of this in the huge popularity of the proof A contingentia mundi. 25. This Latin phrase means from the world's contingency. It often figures a so-called proof of God's existence. The idea is that the contingent world requires a ground in necessity. Thus, by renouncing the primacy of knowledge, we have discovered that the being of the knower and encountered the absolute. the same absolute that the 17th century rationalists defined and constituted logically as an object of knowledge. But precisely, we are concerned here with an absolute existence rather than knowledge. We escape the well-known objection, according to which a known absolute can no longer be absolute, because it becomes relative to the knowledge we have of it. For here, the absolute is not the result of a logical construction in the field of knowledge. Sorry, with the subject of the most concrete experiences. And this is in no way relative to this experience. Because of this experience, it is therefore a non-substantial absolute. The ontological error of Cartesian rationalism was not to have seen that if we define the absolute in terms of the primacy of existence over essence, we cannot conceive of it as a substance. There is nothing substantial about consciousness. It is a pure appearance, which thus means it exists only to the extent of which it appears. But it is precisely because consciousness is pure appearance, because it is a total void, since the entire world is outside it, because of this identity within it, between its appearance and existence, that it can be considered as the absolute. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not getting this. But page 4, like how long can I read? To 5 maybe? So it's like 2 pages to get to 5, and then how many pages is it? No, that is my actually, this is low-key the day I bought it, which is February 2nd, 2024. No way. Hold on. Actually, look at this. I don't know if I can show this. I don't know if I get doxxed, but look at this. February 2nd, 2024. Like, this is a transfer. And today is February 2nd, so it's literally been like 2 years since I bought this book. That's kind of depressing. It's been 2 years and I haven't read it. Anyway, what page am I? 16, and reading to page 24 to get to part 6 is pretty crazy. This is the introduction, by the way. Like, do you think I could read up to page 30? It's taken me an hour and 20 minutes to read up to page 17. Okay. Now look, he just doxed myself, but whatever. No, I didn't. It's okay, because anybody can go to that station. We have appeared to reach the end of our investigation. Having reduced things to the combined totality of their appearances, we notice that these appearances called for a being that was no longer itself an appearance. The percipi directed to a percipiens whose being was revealed to us as consciousness. Thus, we have reached the ontological foundation of knowledge, the first thing to whom all other appearances appear, the absolute, in relation to which each phenomenon is relative. This being is not the subject in the Kantian sense of the term, but subjectivity itself in its self-immanence. In arriving here, we have escaped idealism. Have we? I don't think I've escaped idealism yet. According to which is measured by knowledge and is therefore subject to the law of duality. For idealism, all being is known, including thought itself. Thought appears to itself only through its own products, such that we only ever grasp it as the meaning of thoughts that have occurred, and the philosopher in search of thought is obliged to consult the constituted sciences in order to derive derive thought from them as their condition of possibility. We have apprehended a being, on the contrary, that escapes and founds our knowledge, and we have laid hold of thought, not as it is given in representation, or as the meaning of thoughts that have been expressed, but directly as it is, and this mode of apprehension is not a phenomenon of knowledge, but the structure of being. We find ourselves here on the terrain of Husserlian phenomenology, even though Husserl himself was not always faithful to his primary intuition. Are we satisfied? Have we found a trans-phenomenal being? But it is really the being to which the phenomenon of being points. Is it really the being of the phenomenon? In other words, is the being of consciousness sufficient to have found the being of appearance qua appearance? We have robbed the phenomenon of its being in order to give consciousness, and we expected consciousness subsequently to return it. In consciousness, is consciousness able to do that? By examining the ontological requirements of the percipi, we will find out. We should note at the outset that there is a being of the perceived thing qua perceived. Even if I wanted to reduce this table to a synthesis of subjective impressions, I would have to notice at least that it reveals itself as a table through that synthesis, of which it is the transcendent limit, the principle and the goal. The table stands before our knowledge and cannot be assimilated to the knowledge we gain from it. Otherwise, it would be consciousness, that is, pure immanence, and would dissolve as a table. On the same grounds, even if what separates the table from the synthesis of subjective impressions through what is apprehended is purely a distinction within reason, at least the table cannot be this synthesis. That would reduce it to a synthetic activity of combination. 26. Une activité synthetique de liaison. Here I translate liaison as combination, which is normally used to translate Kant's Verbindung into English. It is likely that Sartre takes this phrase from Kant. Insofar, then, as the known cannot be absorbed into our knowledge of it, we must recognize its being. This being, we are told, is the percipi, which is the perceived or the perceiving, whichever one it is. It does matter which one it is, but I don't even remember anymore. And 2 more pages, and then maybe I can take a break. It's been like an hour and a half. Us acknowledge from the outset that we can no more reduce the being of the percipi to that of the percipients. That is consciousness. That we can reduce the table to the combination of representations. The most we can say is that it is relative to that being, though that relativity does not excuse us from the need to inspect the percipi's being. Now, the mode of the percipi is passive. If, then, the phenomenon's being resides in its percipi, its being will be passivity. The characteristic structures of isi, insofar as it will be reduced to percepi, turn out to be relativity and passivity. What is passivity? I'm passive when I undergo a modification which I am not the origin. That is to say, neither the foundation or the creator. I don't know, so it's like maybe getting surgery. Kind of. Not really. Only to be able to support something. I still need to exist, and my existence is in consequence always located beyond passivity. For example, passively supporting something is an attitude that I uphold, which engages my freedom just as much as resolutely rejecting it. If I am to be forever the person who is offended, I must persevere in my being. In other words, I must assign existence to myself. 27. Translators no GM effect moi même de l'existence. See my note on affecter on notes in translation. Okay. But in so doing, I take up the offense on my own account in some way. I accept this offensive, and I cease to be passive in relation to it. The result is this alternative. Either I am not passive in my being, in which I become the foundation of the ways I'm affected, even if I was not at first their origin, or I am characterized in passivity in my very existence, and my being is received, in which everything collapses into nothingness. Hence, passivity is a double relative phenomenon, relative to the agent's activity and to the patient's existence. From this, it follows that the passivity does not involve the very being of the passive existent. It is a relation between one thing and another being, and not between a being and a nothingness. Oh, holy title drop. Being and a nothingness. Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god. Top 10 books of all time. It is impossible for the percipiere to assign the perceptum. Now there's a perceptum. There's a percipi, a percipiere, and a perceptum as its being, because in order to be assigned anything, the perceptum would already need to be given in some way, and thus to exist before receiving its being. We may think in terms of creation, on conditions that the created being takes possession of itself and separates itself from its creator, in order immediately to close on itself and take up its being. It is the sense that a book exists against its author, but if the act of creation needs... Hold on. Like, this creation is like a religious one. Or actually, they said in the translation, it's like it's related to the religious, like when God created the world, but like he didn't really mean it like that because he's an atheist. But if the act of creation needs to be continued indefinitely, if the created being is supported even in its minutest parts, if it has no proper independence, if it is in itself only a nothingness, then the creature cannot be distinguished at all from its creator, but is reabsorbed within him. What we have here is a false transcendency, and the creator cannot even have the illusion of leaving his subjectivity behind. 28. Sartre's note, it is for this reason that the Cartesian doctrine of substance reaches its logical conclusion in Spinoza's thought. Cartesian like 4 planes, so are there like 4 different thoughts of existence? I don't even know. Moreover, the passivity of the patient demands an equal passivity in the agent. This idea finds expression in the principle of action and reaction. It is possible to crush my hand, to grasp it, or to cut it. That my hand can crush, cut, or grasp. How much passivity should we attribute to perception, to knowledge? They are entirely active, entirely spontaneous. It is precisely because it is pure spontaneity, because nothing can bite into it, that consciousness cannot act on anything. Hence, the doctrine of esse e percepi requires that consciousness, essence of perception, requires that consciousness, a pure spontaneity, unable to act on anything, should bestow being on a transcendent nothingness, while preserving the nothingness of its being. And this is absurd. Husserl attempted to ward off these objections by introducing the passivity into the noesis, namely the Heilix. 29. For Heil, see the section of Husserl's vocabulary. Alright, man. The pure flux of what is lived through, the materiality of the passive syntheses. But all he did was add a further difficulty to those we have mentioned. In effect, he reintroduced those natural givens whose impossibility we demonstrated earlier. Of course, these are not contents of his consciousness, but that only adds to their unintelligibility, for the Heil cannot in fact belong to consciousness, or it would dissolve into translucency and be able to provide the resistant impressional base that we surpass towards the object. 30. As impressional is not an ordinary French word, I translated with a parallel made up in adjective impressional. Base that we surpass towards the object. But if it does not belong to consciousness, what is the source of its being and its opacity? How can we retain at one and at the same time the opaque resistance of things and the subjectivity of thought, no S, since it is not even perceived, and since consciousness transcends it towards its objects, its essence cannot be derived from a perceiver. Maybe, maybe that's what it means. But if we say that it derives its essence only from itself, we return to the insoluble problem of how consciousness can relate to any independent existence. And even if we were to concede that noesis has a hyletic layer, we would still be able to conceive how consciousness could transcend this subjective element towards objectivity by endowing the Heil with the characteristics of a thing and the characteristics of consciousness. Husserl believed he could facilitate the passage from one to the other, but he succeeded only in creating a hybrid being that consciousness rejects and cannot be part of the world. But in addition, the percepi implies that reality governs the being of the perceptum. Is it conceivable that the being of the known should be relative to our knowledge of it? What could the relativity of its being mean in the case of an existent other than the existence? Being lies in something other than itself. In other words, an existence that it is not. Oh, Leo, why is the camera so messed up? Admittedly, it is not inconceivable for a being to be external to itself. If we take this to mean that the being is its own externality, but that is not the case here. Okay, now I've kind of lost my mind. Like, I'm not even paying attention to what I'm reading anymore. The perceiving before stands before a consciousness that cannot penetrate and that cannot make contact with it, and as it is cut off from consciousness, it exists cut off from its own existence. It is no use to claim, as Husserl did, that it is irreal. Even if the status of what is perceived is irreal, it has to exist. Thus, there is no case in which either of the two determinations of relativity and passivity, which concern ways of being, is applicable to being itself. The esse of the phenomenon cannot be its percepi. The trans-phenomenal being of consciousness cannot provide the foundation for the phenomenon's trans-phenomenal being. We can see that the phenomenalists' mistake, having correctly reduced the object to the series of its combined appearances, they thought they had reduced its being to the succession of its ways of being. That is why they try to explain being in terms of concepts which apply only to ways of being, because they refer to relations between a plurality of beings that already exist. Holy, what a mouthful. Okay. No, to be honest, like, if I, what do you call it? Can I really get, no, like, I cannot get to the fucking end of this. Nope. Actually, I'm not gonna lie, it's just 8 more pages, so right now we're gonna take a little break, so give me a minute. Hello, this thing back on. Yeah, I basically just wasted 20 minutes. Anyway, fuck, I really don't want to keep reading, to be honest. Better at least finish the first part. So we went here. The ontological proof. Ontological means like, it's like a fact or something. We have not been given its due. We thought that our discovery of the transphenomenality of the being of consciousness excused us from the need to grant any trans-phenomenal being to the phenomenon. On the contrary, as we will see, the trans-phenomenality of consciousness actually requires the phenomenon's being to be trans-phenomenal. We can derive an ontological proof, not from the reflexive cogito, but the pre-reflexive being of the percipients. Let us try to set it out here. All consciousness is consciousness of something. We can take this definition of consciousness in two distinct ways. We can take it to mean either that consciousness is constitutive of its owner's beings, constitutive, or that consciousness is in its innermost nature related to a transcendent being. But the first interpretation of the phrase destroys itself. To be conscious of something is to confront a full and concrete presence that is not consciousness. Doubtless, one can be conscious of an absence, but the absence must necessarily appear against a ground of presence. Now, as we have seen, consciousness is a real subjectivity and an impression is a subjective plentitude. But this subjectivity cannot step outside itself in order to posit a transcendent object by conferring it upon the plentitude of the impression. If therefore we want at any cost to make the phenomenon's being depend on consciousness, the object will need to distinguish itself from consciousness not through its presence but through its absence, not through plentitude but through its nothingness. If being belongs to consciousness, the object must differ from consciousness not insofar as it is another being, but insofar as it is a non-being. Here we have the recourse to the infinite that we discussed in our first section of this work. For Husserl, for example, the animation of the hyletic core by only those intentions which find their fulfillment, Erfüllung, in the Heil is not sufficient to take us out of the domain of subjectivity. The genuinely objectifying intentions, 32. So let's look at 31 and 32. Travers le remplissement. See my note on remplir. Okay, les intentions. See my note on adjective. Okay, alright. Are empty intentions. Intentions I aim beyond the present and subjective appearance at the infinite totality of the series of appearances. Let us be clear, moreover, that these intentions aim at them as appearances that cannot ever be given all the same time. The fact that it is necessarily impossible for the infinite number of terms in the series to stand before consciousness simultaneously, in conjunction with the fact that all but one of these terms is really absent, is the foundation of objectivity. If these impressions are present, even if their numbers were infinite, they would become merged into subjectivity. Their absence is what gives them objective being. Thus, the object's being is a pure non-being. There's something wrong with this camera. It defines itself as lack. It is elusive. Something as a matter of principle can never be given. That is delivered through successive fleeting profiles. But how can a non-being be the foundation of being? How can something that is subjectively absent and expected thereby become objective? I will grant that a great joy that I am hoping for, or I'm reading too fast because I want to get the book over with. So honestly, I should probably just yell at 7 more pages. Or a sorrow that I fear may thereby acquire a kind of transcendence, but this transcendence within immanence does not take us out of the subjective. It is true that things are given through profiles, which means quite simply through appearances. But each of these is already on its own a transcendent being, and not a subjective impressional matter. A plentitude of being, not a lack, a presence, not a absence, not an absence. It would be fruitless to attempt a sleight of hand to found the object's reality on the subjective, impressional plentitude and its objectivity on non-being. We will never get objectivity out of the subjective or transcendent out of immanence. or being out of non-being, but it might be said it is precisely as transcendence. Husserl defines consciousness, indeed, that is his postulate and his essential discovery, but once he makes of the noma something unreal, the correlative of the noesis, and whose SC is a percipi, he completely betrays his own principle. Consciousness is consciousness of something. Therefore, transcendence is a constitutive substructure of consciousness, which is to say that consciousness is both bearing on a being that it is not. 33. Translators note, no English verb has the combination of meaning potisser in the sentence, although directed upon is the primary meaning. The verb porter means to carry. Such as italics are to suggest the idea that consciousness is carried by its object. Let us call this an ontological proof. To this one might reply that a demand on the part of consciousness does not prove that this demand must be satisfied, but the objection is powerless in relation to an analysis of Husserl's intentionality, about whose essential character he was mistaken. To say that consciousness is conscious of something means that the entire being of consciousness is subsumed within this specific obligation, to be a revealing intuition of something, that is, of a transcendental being. Pure subjectivity, if that is what is given first, will not only fail to transcend itself in order to posit anything objective, but in addition, any pure subjectivity will dissolve. Used properly, the term subjectivity refers to a consciousness of consciousness. But this consciousness of being consciousness must in some way be qualified, and it can only be qualified as a revealing intuition, otherwise it is nothing. Now, a revealing intuition implies something revealed. Absolute subjectivity can constitute itself only in relation to something revealed. Immanence can defy itself only in its grasp of something transcendent. This may sound like an echo of Kant's refutation of problematic idealism, but really, we should be thinking of Descartes. We are at the level of being here, not of knowledge. It is not a matter of showing that the phenomena of inner sense imply the existence of objective and spatial phenomena, but that consciousness implies in its being a non-conscious and trans-phenomenal being. In particular, it is pointless to reply that the subjectivity does in fact imply objectivity, and that in constituting the objective domain, it constitutes itself. We have seen that subjectivity lacks any power to constitute the objective. To say that consciousness is conscious of something is to say that it must produce itself as the revealed revelation of a being that it is not, and which is given as already existing when it is revealed. In this way, having set out from pure appearance, we have arrived in the fullness of being. Consciousness is a being whose existence posits its essence, and inversely, it is conscious of a being whose essence implies its existence. That is a being whose appearance demands being. Being is everywhere. Admittedly, we could apply to consciousness the definition that Heidegger reserves for Dasein, and say that it is a being for whom, in its being is in question. 34. Heidegger characterizes the scene like this in page 4 of Being in Time. Like, they're expecting me to have this book, but like, why the hell would I have that book? Like, why would I want to buy? Like, I don't have that book, man. But whatever. But one would have to complete it and formulate it roughly like this. Consciousness is a being for whom, in its being, there is a question of its being insofar as this being implies a being other than itself. Naturally, This being is none other than the trans-phenomenal being of phenomena and not a noumenal being hiding behind them. Consciousness implies the being of this table, of this pack of tobacco, of the lamp, and more generally, the being of the world. Consciousness inquires simply of the being of that which appears does not exist only insofar as it appears. The transphenomenal being of that which is for consciousness is itself in itself. Part 6, being in itself. It's a few more pages before I'm home free. We are now able to provide some clarification of the phenomenon of being that we consulted in order to establish our preceding remarks. Consciousness is a revealed revelation of existence, and these existences appear before consciousness on the foundation of their being. Nevertheless, it is characteristic of the being of an extent not to disclose itself in person to consciousness. An existent cannot be stripped of its being. Being is the existence ever-present foundation. It is in it everywhere and it is nowhere. There is no being that is not the being of some way of being, and being can be grasped only through the way of being that manifests it and conceals it at the same time. However, consciousness can always surpass an existent, not toward its being, but towards this being's meaning. That is what makes it possible to call consciousness ontico-ontological, because a fundamental characteristic of its transcendence is to transcend the ontic towards the ontological. The meaning of the existence being, insofar as it discloses itself to consciousness, is the phenomenon of being. This meaning itself has a being, on whose foundation it manifests itself. It is from this point of view that the well-known scholastic argument can be understood, according to which there is a vicious circle in any proposition concerning being. Since any judgment about being already implies being, but in fact there is no vicious circle, because it is not necessary to surpass the being of this meaning again. Towards its meaning, the meaning of being is the same for the being of any phenomenon, including its own being. The phenomenon of being is not the same as being, as we have already noted, but indicates being and requires it. Although in truth, the ontological proof that we mentioned earlier does not apply especially or uniquely to it, there is one ontological proof, which applies to the whole domain of consciousness. But this proof is sufficient to justify everything we can learn from the phenomenon of being. The phenomenon of being, like any basic phenomenon, is disclosed immediately to consciousness. At every moment, we have what Heidegger calls a pre-ontological understanding of it, which means an understanding that has not been fixed in concepts or elucidated. What we should do now, therefore, is to examine this phenomenon and try by this means to determine the meaning of being. However, we must note that 1. The elucidation of this meaning of being only applies to the being of this phenomenon, as the being of consciousness is radically different. Its meaning will require its own distinctive elucidation based on the revealed revelation of another type of being for itself, which we will define later, and which contrasts with the phenomenon's being in itself. 2. The elucidation of the meaning of being in itself that we will attempt here can only be provisional. The aspects that will be brought to light to imply other meanings, which must be apprehended and determined at a lower stage. The preceding reflections have in particular allowed us to distinguish 2 absolutely distinct regions of being: the being of the pre-reflexive cogito and the being of the phenomenon. But also, although the concept of beings is therefore characterized by its division into two incommunicable regions, we must still explain how these two regions can be placed under the same heading. That will require us to inspect these two types of being, and it is clear that we will not be able genuinely to apprehend the meaning of either of them until we have established their real relations with the notion of being in general and the relations that link them. We have, in fact, established by examining the non-positional consciousness of self that the being of the phenomenon cannot in any case act on consciousness. Through that, we have ruled out a realist conception of the phenomenon's relation with consciousness. But we have also shown, by examining the spontaneity of the non-reflexive cogito, that if subjectivity was given to consciousness first, it would not be possible for consciousness to step out of it, and neither would consciousness to be able to act on transcended being, or to include the elements of passivity necessary to continue. Without contradiction, a transcendent being on their basis, we have hereby ruled out the idealist solution to the problem. We seem to have closed every door and to have condemned ourselves to seeing transcended being and consciousness as two enclosed totalities with no possible communication between them. We will have to show the problem allows of another solution beyond realism and idealism. However, some characteristics can be established immediately because for the most part, they show up for themselves in what we have just said. A clear view of the phenomenon of being has been clouded by a widespread prejudice that we will call creationism. As it was supposed that God had given being to our world, being had always appeared to be colored by a certain passivity, but a creation ex nihilo cannot explain how. A creation from nothing cannot explain how being arises. Maybe that's what it means. Because if being is conceived within a subjectivity, even a divine subjectivity, it remains an intrasubjective mode of being. Within such a subjectivity, objectivity could not even be represented, and in consequence, it could not even be moved by its will to create something objective. Moreover, even if being could be placed all of a sudden outside subjectivity by the means of the fulguration that Leibniz talks about, it could only affirm itself as being in spite of and against its creator. Otherwise, it would merge back into him by removing any Selbstständigkeit 35 is German for independence. The philosophical use of this term that Sartre has in mind is the idea of something being capable of existing on its own self-sufficiently. As the Germans call it, from being. The theory of continuous creation makes it vanish into the divine subjectivity. If being exists in the face of God, it is because it provides its own support, because it does not retain the faintest trace of divine creation. In short, even if it had been created, being in itself could not be explained by creation, because beyond that creation, it takes up its own being. That is equivalent to saying that being is uncreated. So, like, it always existed. I think he's trying to say, like, God did not make that, like, in his belief. But one should not conclude that being creates itself. Okay, then I was literally proven wrong in the next sentence. So, like, what the fuck do I know? That would require it to exist antecedently to itself. Being cannot be causa sui in the manner of consciousness. I spat on the fucking thing. Do you see that? Ew, ew, ew. Fucking disgusting. Someone put this guy down. That is equivalent to saying that being is uncreated, but one should not conclude that being creates itself. That would, okay, I read this already. That implies that it is neither passivity nor activity. Each one of these notions is human and refers to a human behavior or instruments of human behavior. Activity occurs when a conscious being employs some means with a view to achieving some end. And we call the objects which we apply our activity passive, insofar as they do not spontaneously aim for the end which we put them to use. In brief, man is active and the means he employs are said to be passive. Taken to the absolute, these concepts lose all meaning. In particular, being is still not active, for there is to be any end or means being is required. Still less can it be passive, for to be passive something must be. Being's consistence in itself is equally beyond the active and passive, is equally beyond negation and affirmation. An affirmation is always the affirmation of something, which is to say that the act of affirming is distinct from the thing affirmed. But if we imagine the affirming in which the affirmed is filled up by what is affirmed, that affirmation cannot be affirmed because of the surfeit of plenitude and the noima's immediate inherence within the noesis. This is indeed what being is. Yeah, can I look that stuff up? Noema, noesis. Noema and noesis. The noesis would be doing the thinking and noema would be the object. Okay. So one is like the thinker and one is the thought. So this is like thought and this is thinker. This is indeed what being is. If to clarify our thinking, we define it as a term of consciousness. It is the thought within the thinker, i.e. a self-inherence without the slightest distance. Immanence. You know, let me look that word up too, because I don't know what that means. Holds that the divine encompasses or is manifested. Okay, blah blah blah. A self-inheritance without the slightest distance, it would be wrong to call it immanence, because immanence, after all, a relation between something of itself. It is the smallest distance that is possible for something to have in relation to itself. But being is not a relation to itself, it is itself. It is an immanence that cannot be actualized, an affirmation that cannot be affirmed, an activity that cannot act because it has become thickened by itself. It is as if a decompression of being were required to liberate an affirmation of itself in the heart of being. Nor should we understand being as one undifferentiated self-affirmation. The lack of differentiation in the in itself lies beyond an infinite number of self-affirmations, insofar as there is an infinite number of ways of affirming oneself. We can sum up these first results by saying being is in itself. But if being is in itself, that means that it does not refer to itself, unlike consciousness of self. This itself is what it is. Indeed, we reach the point at which the constant reflection that constitutes any itself merges into identity. And that is why being is ultimately beyond any itself, and our initial formulation cannot be more than an approximation due to the necessities of language. 36. In this passage, Sartre seems to use the same French word soi to mean itself as in being for itself, and self as in the consciousness of self. The basic point being made is that we should not be misled by the term itself into thinking that being in itself relates to itself. See my note on soi. Sartre discusses the misleading aspect of the term itself as it appears in the compound of in itself. Yeah, I'm lost. Anyway, in fact, being so opaque to itself precisely because it is filled with itself. We can express this better by saying that being is what it is. Oh, it is what it is. This formulation appears to be strictly analytical. In fact, a great distance separates it from the principle of identity, regarded as the unconditional principle of all analytical judgments. For a start, it refers to a particular region of being, that of being in itself. We will see that the being of the for itself is defined, on the contrary, as being what is not and not being what it is. We are dealing, therefore, with a principle that is regional and as such synthetic. Moreover, this formulation, being in itself is what it is, needs to be contrasted with the one which designates the being of consciousness. This latter, as in fact we will see, has to be what it is. This informs us of the special sense that we need to give to the is in the phrase being is what it is. Once there are beings which have to be what they are, the fact of being what one is not in any way is a purely axiomatic characteristic. It is a contingent principle of being in itself. In this sense, the principle of identity, the principle of analytical judgment, is also a regional synthetic principle of being. It refers to the opacity of being in itself. This opacity is not a function of our position in relation to the in itself, such that we are obliged to learn about it and observe it because we are situated outside. Being in itself has no inside that could be opposed to an outside. Like a judgment or law or self-consciousness, the in itself has no secret. It is massive. In a sense, we can call it a synthesis, but it is the most indissoluble of syntheses, the synthesis of self with self. From this, it evidently follows that being is isolated in its beings and maintains no relationship with anything else. Transitions and becomings, anything that allows one to say that being is not yet what it will be, and that it is already what it is not. All of this is necessarily ruled out by being. Because being is the being of becoming, it is thereby beyond becoming. It is what it is. Which means that on its own, it cannot even not be what it is not. Indeed, we saw that it does not include any negation in its full positivity. Thus, alterity is unknown to it. It never presents itself as other than some other being. I cannot sustain any relationship with the other. It is itself indefinitely and exhausts itself in being it. From this point of view, as we will see later, it escapes temporarily. It is, and when it collapses, one cannot even say that it is no longer, or at least a consciousness, precisely because it is temporal, can become conscious of it as no longer being. But it does not itself exist as something missing from what it was. The full positivity of being reforms itself where it collapsed. It was, and now other beings are. That is all. Finally, this will be our third characteristic. Being of itself is. In other words, a being can neither be nor be derived from the possible, nor can it be equipped with the necessary. Necessity concerns the connection between ideal prepositions, not the connection between existence. A phenomenal existent can never, as an existent, be derived from another being in itself. Where was I? A phenomenal existent can never be derived from another existent. This is called the contingency of being in itself. But neither can being in itself be derived from something possible. The possible is a structure of the for itself, and so it belongs to the other region of being. Being in itself is never either possible or impossible. It is. Consciousness expresses this by saying in anthropomorphic terms that it is the trop, which is to say that it is absolutely unable to derive it from anything, either from another being or from something possible, or from a necessary law, uncreated without any reason for a being or any relationship with any other being. Being in itself is de trop for all eternity. Being is itself. Being is what it is. These are the three features that our provisional examination of the phenomenon of being enables us to assign to the being of phenomena. For the moment, it is impossible to continue with our investigation further. An examination of the in itself, which is only ever what it is, will not enable us to establish and explicate its reasons with the for itself. Thus, by taking appearances at our point of departure, for we have been gradually led to posit two types of beings, the in itself and the for itself, about which our information is still only incomplete and superficial. A host of unanswered questions still remain. What is the fundamental meaning of these two types of being? What is the reason for their both belonging to being in general? What is the meaning of being insofar as it includes within it these two radically distinct regions of being? If both idealism and realism fail to explain the relations that in fact unite these regions, which are in principle incommunicable, what other solutions to this problem can we find, and how can the being of the phenomenon be transphenomenal? My purpose in writing this work has been to try to answer these questions. And then part one, like we just made it to part one. Okay, well fuck this. That's enough from me. So anyway, that's basically it. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe for more, and fucking do whatever, and follow everything I own. So thank you, I love you, and good night. Let's end.